introduction. Thanks also to Wendy and to all the organizers. It's an honor for me to be able to share some of the research I've been doing on AI adoption in the public sector. I will share with you some of the empirical research, but the idea is for this to be a conversation starter so that we are able to have a discussion later on. So I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So first things first, why should we care about AI? Well, one of the reasons was formulated by English-Hungarian philosopher Polanyi, who observed that we know more than we can tell. Some tasks we are very good at as humans, but we just are unable to describe them as a series of instructions. Now, this is a problem because with traditional programming, you always need a series of very structured instructions to make a computer work. So you base an if-then logic for the programming. Now, AI potentially can automate tasks that humans are not able to articulate. So if you were to teach a child to walk, you wouldn't be able to do that by writing a handbook. And similarly, you wouldn't be able to teach anybody to ride a bicycle just by writing some instructions. So as a result, now we are in the new AI spring, where there's new breakthroughs regarding the possibility to automate tasks, from playing games to walking. And then there's these very interesting insights about humans being beaten also at almost creative tasks, such as playing a Go game. Now, this is used in the public sector in a wide variety of ways. So the US Army now is using AI-powered chatbots for recruiting new prospective soldiers. There are uses of parsing restaurant reviews in order to anticipate which restaurants would need a hygiene inspection from the authorities, to the data-driven justice initiative from the White House in the US that aims at deciding which inmates to put to home arrest based on some of behavioral and social demographic characteristics. Now, what is the research problem here? One of the things that is emerging is that there's no clear understanding of what exactly AI technology should be used for in public sector. And also, different stakeholders see AI differently. So we started with this research question, just trying to understand how different stakeholders in the public sector interpret artificial intelligence technology. The case study we have here is the use of AI in public healthcare. And this is an ongoing research project that I've been pursuing now for a couple of years. The technology in focus here is IBM Watson. IBM Watson here has been showcased some years ago as beating the champion of the TV show Jeopardy. So it's able to work with natural language processing and also able to identify a lot of contextual or subtle clues in analyzing structured and unstructured data. In the health sector, IBM Watson has launched this quite successful application in order to support doctors in the choice of cancer treatment. So by choosing as sources of data, structured data from the existing research literature, medical research literature, but also unstructured data such as body scans, medical imaging, and electronic medical records, IBM Watson Health is being used in public hospitals to support decisions for cancer treatment. So we focused on and collected data from the first public hospital in China that has adopted this system. And we aimed at identifying different stakeholders' view of the technology. So we interviewed hospital managers, doctors as one group, but also managers of IT firms that support the implementation of this technology, and also government policymakers engaged in providing policy guidelines and regulating the adoption of AI in public healthcare. So as a result, we had a wide range of views, both using primary data and secondary data from all these three stakeholders: government policymakers, IT managers, and doctors, hospital managers. Now, the research question being in comparing and contrasting the different ways that the stakeholders interpret artificial intelligence technology. And in order to do that, we adopted the theoretical lens of technological frames of reference, a classic theoretical tool by Orlikowski and Gesh. We have three dimensions here to try to understand how technology is framed: the nature of technology, basically how do the stakeholder think what the technology is, the technology strategy, so the motivation for the organization to adopt the technology, and last, the technology in use, which is the actual conditions and consequences associated with the daily use of the technology. So how is the technology used on a day-to-day basis in the framing of each of the stakeholders? Now, the results here have been also went through the lens of understanding how artificial intelligence is seen as a tool. And in order to grasp that, we looked into a categorization of information technology by Orlikowski and Yakono, 2001. So there's four main ways whereby IT can be seen as a tool: a productivity tool to achieve performance benefits, a labor substitution tool to replace human labor, IT as an information processing tool, and finally, IT as a social relations tool, meaning a tool to transform social roles, but also communication patterns. So we try to map these four dimensions among the three stakeholders, and the findings have been quite interesting. So government policymakers mostly see AI as a productivity tool. They always refer to efficiency as being of the highest importance and increasing competitiveness of the public healthcare sector. IT firm managers, on the other hand, add up to the productivity view also a view of IT as AI as an information processing tool. So they expect Watson to be able to dig some new knowledge from the data sets of medical cases. Last, the doctors have a much more nuanced and multifaceted framing of AI. They see it as an efficiency tool, as a productivity tool, but also they reflect on the impact on social relations. So for instance, they mention explicitly that AI using IBM Watson in the hospital will improve the reputation of the hospital vis-a-vis other hospitals. So if we try to map this, you can see that when we layer the different stakeholders, we see an enrichment of the nuances of framing as we go from the top of government policymakers through the IT firm managers down to the doctors and hospital managers. You can visually see this in the sense that the doctors, hospital manager have the most colorful of the framing of it all, while the government policymakers, both in the dimension of nature, strategy, and technology tool, have a complete dominance of AI as a productivity tool. You can also see that the view of productivity tool is shared among all three classes of stakeholders, while the other framings are not. Information processing framing is shared between IT firm managers and doctors, and only doctors mention AI as a labor substitution tool. So in this initial findings, we see that the changes in the framing changes according to the levels of practical engagement with the technology. Government policymakers do not on a daily basis deal with the AI technology, whereas doctors and hospital managers do it on a daily basis. So since AI is an emerging technology, all stakeholders are operating in an environment that has limited information to develop these technological frames. So we try to conceptualize this and identify a sort of a trickle-down mechanism whereby the dominant framing that is provided by the government policymakers is sort of trickle down and influences the other layers of stakeholders through different influence mechanisms. The mechanism of influence between stakeholders as government policymakers and IT firm managers is the one of policy guidelines, whereas IT firm managers influence the doctors and hospital managers through training and support. The other interesting phenomenon that we saw was also that, as said before, the enrichment of the framing is proportional to the level of technological, to the level of practical engagement with the technology. The government policymakers who have the least level of engagement on a daily basis with the technology have a much more monolithic, one-dimensional view of AI as a technology, whereas the doctors and hospital managers are the ones that have the most nuanced framing. So the findings for now are of different nature. The first one is more theoretical in nature. If you look at the IS research on technological frames of reference, usually incongruence among frames is correlated with negative outcomes, for instance, failure in the implementation. In this case, we see that the incongruence is not necessarily related to negative outcomes, but actually gives leads to a sort of a sustainable a way of framing the technology that at the end of the day works. The second one is that we try to highlight the role of the public sector context in theorizing IS framing. And the third one, we suggest some mechanisms of influence between different incongruent frames. This is research in progress, so we call, of course, for future research to articulate these mechanisms even better. This is also a part of work that I've been carrying out not only in the environment of China, but also as part of work that the European Commission is doing into mapping the policy initiatives of all European Union member states in relation to artificial intelligence in public service. So if we consider these policy initiatives as sort of independent variables of how AI is implemented in the public sector, what we're trying to do now is to map the nature of these different policy initiatives. And one of the things that we started doing is to distinguish on the using the lens of Vedun policy instruments distinction between sticks, carrots, and sermons. We try to distinguish between which of these policy instruments is dominant across different European Union members. By sticks, we identify binding laws and regulation. The metaphor of carrots is the one of economic incentives, whereas sermons are more communication campaigns, private-public partnership, voluntary codes of conduct, and similar. So what we see is that we can map the different policy initiatives regarding AI in public sector, and we see sort of unsurprisingly that sermons are the ones that in European Union member states are still dominant among all the policy initiatives. So the questions for now will be, what will be the implications of the different nature of these type of policy initiatives, and how can we articulate the way these different framings of technology, of AI technology, are trickled down across different layers of stakeholders that are involved in these complex ecosystems. So I would like really to hear from you about these inputs, and I thank you again for the opportunity to share some of these first inputs regarding AI in the public sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronnie. We can just, I have a couple of questions, but I saw anyway in the chat, we have, it was a very fascinating presentation, Ronnie. Thank you very much. And it gives also a complete awareness of how these AI policies are dealt in, both in different contexts. And I'd like to pick up a point from Iman Tani in the chat. Iman wrote, perhaps an incentive alignment perspective can be a good approach for the adoption challenges in the public sector. And I assume that this, and maybe Imani can speak up if you want to further articulate this point. And Ronnie, you can, if you want, you can reply, and we wait for other
Hello.
contribution. Oh, hi, Imani.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Ronnie. Thank you very much for this presentation. My point was about the incentive alignment because it's a challenge in the public sector since usually adoption of IT technology is a push from the government to the hospitals or the health institutes. So they are pushed to adopt this. So stakeholders have different incentives regarding the adoption, whether to adopt or not. And I have been reading some papers about incentive alignments in strategic management journals, and you can find some interesting ideas of how to align all of the incentives from different stakeholders. And perhaps it will be a good contribution to the public sector. It's because it's different than the private. It's not a push technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think that will be a nice angle to this. What I can say is that in this preliminary research, we were initially really struck by the fact that even before talking about incentives to implement the technology, there was a real diversity in really framing what the technology is for. So even before being able to argue on what the goals of the technology should be and what should be the motivations for adopting it, there is such a heterogeneity of views of what the technology actually does or what it's supposed to do. But obviously, I think as the literature on AI in public sector matures, these perspectives related to incentive to adoption and implementation will become more and more important. There's a big window of opportunity there from a research point of view.
Antonio?
Hi, Ronnie. Thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry for the very informal way of appearing, but in the middle of moving house. So, and it's nice to have some intellectual activity in the between of moving boxes. I found it fascinating. I think you have an incredible empirical material. I have a question about, this perception about AI. And the question is, I know it might be very, very broad and maybe too difficult to answer given the study, but why do you think there is, or what is the reason of this perception about the role of AI? And if there is anything which is specific about the way in which AI and learning algorithms works, which shape this perception?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, it's $1 million question. And of course, I would have no empirical support to ground my own personal intuition at this stage. I think one of the things that I've been experiencing is that there's a lot of the power of legacy in the framing. So in the same way that you could argue the first automobiles were looking a lot like horseless carriages, we have the legacy of framing of technology from different stakeholders that are based on previous office automation technologies. So I think we see sort of reproposition of this as a way for stakeholders to fill in this cognitive gap while we're still trying to make sense of the AI technology. So that could be one explanation why the most prompt cognitive heuristic for framing AI technology from policymakers is the one of efficiency tool, the same as it has been used for office automation before, new public management, and so forth. The first way for doctors to see as AI is as a labor substitution tool, because this is a legacy from previous technology. I think it will be interesting to see from a longitudinal point of view how this will evolve over time. I have the impression that it will, but it will as a function of to what extent we have more experience with the technology in itself. So long story short, I think it's a cognitive legacy from previous technology.
Thank you.
We have some comments in the chat about the how influence is presented in a hierarchical way, and tell us from Tony Comfort, tell us something about the relatively poor potential for AI. And also, again, another point from Edgar on the alignment of incentives. Ronnie, can you, if you want to touch on these points?
Yes. No, I think Tony's point is it's very fair, and I think I guess time will tell. You know, one way to look at to interpret this data, these initial results, is the fact that if you see these type of trickle down hierarchy, it might be an indicator of a potential that is below the expectations. That's one way to look at it. Absolutely. I don't know. I think I wouldn't be able to make a guess for the future, or, you know, I think Tony mentions the mobile phone technology comparison, and I'm not well versed in the mobile technology literature to make a comparison on whether this could be an indicator of the fact that the AI impact is below the expectation because of the way the different stakeholders frame it. But it is a very good point. Edgar, that refers to the alignment of incentives, and you indicate that the benefits of AI are not as obvious as the proponents suggest. I'm not sure, could you elaborate on that, Edgar?
Yeah, so it was kind of following on from Tony's comment, and also reflecting on Iman's suggestion. When you talk about, well, when Iman talked about aligning incentives, and Tony talked about the hierarchy of influence, that kind of raises the question about what status does the AI have? And I was just kind of thinking, how different would this be if we were talking about, I don't know, the use of ERP systems in government, or the use of client-server architectures in government, or and we could choose a technology that's kind of failed miserably as well, where there would be people saying, this is really fantastic. Everybody ought to be doing this. We ought to incentivize people to use this technology in this kind of way. And I think Tony's point was just saying, well, what happens if AI is a technology that needs to be pushed because it's not so good, whereas something like mobile phones, everyone could immediately see the benefits. You didn't need to align incentives to adopt the use of mobile telephones, whereas perhaps as framed, it's a little bit more pushy. But I can see Tony wants to clarify what he was saying, and I'll shut up.
Right. No, that's a very good point. I think, though, there's a clarification to be made here. The way I interpret this trickling down mechanism that you see, and the richness of the framing that increases across the different layers of stakeholders, it's not necessarily a synonym of lack of buy-in. You could actually argue it's an indicator of the opposite. Maybe the policymakers have these monolithic, fuzzy view of the technology simply because they don't use it themselves, whereas the ones who are using it see the richness of it and therefore the potential, and therefore have this much richer framing of it, not just as an efficiency tool, but also as a social relations, information processing tool, and so forth. So that could be interpreted as the opposite, as there's a will to influence from top down, but actually the richness of framing comes from the bottom. So that's one way, but that's, like, you know, your guess is as good as mine in this sense. But it's a very good point.
Could I just sort of explain my idea? I remember about 15, 18 years ago at a American Medical Informatics Conference, asking a panel of the great and the good at that time what the impact of mobile phones was going to be on the delivery of healthcare in hospitals. And they all said, it won't, it can't. We can't clean them, we can't wash them, they're a health risk, we can't control the information on them. They had every argument why mobile phones would never penetrate into hospital healthcare. At the same time, we were doing research about medicines and drugs in hospitals. And at that time, everywhere you went, surreptitiously, a nurse or a doctor was taking their phone out to check the pharmacy databases that their institution didn't provide them with, but their mobile phone did. And you could see, I sensed at the time, and subsequently I was proved right, I guess, the great and the good, the managers, the top people, had just misunderstood this technology. It was fermenting from the bottom up, and it was going to power its way into the institutions. That's number one. That's sort of partly that's my example of mobile phones. They came from the bottom up, not from the top down, in healthcare at least. My second sort of observation is, we're talking about IBM Watson, the most big, heavy, centralized kind of AI you could ever imagine. That may tell you something too about any technology's ability to penetrate. That's sort of what Edgar was saying, I think. You know, technologies don't enter from the top. They don't, or at least they struggle. I'll stop there.
Very good point. Starting from the last one, the other point that we didn't have time to touch upon here, and this is covered in another paper that came out recently, is also that not only IBM Watson is a big boy coming in the context, but it's a foreign big boy. So this is in the context of China, and since the data collection, now the Chinese are pushing their own AI in healthcare product, and IBM Watson has sort of been the sandbox, which is being put aside. But that's another relation to the context. But yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it is a fact that the hype cycle curve shape almost never matches the diffusion adoption curve shape, and that's just yet another example. Very good point.
I think we have another question from Mayur. Mayur, if you can ask directly or your question or make your point so we can be a little more interactive. And then I think, Ronnie, you can reply and we can thank you and move on to the next speaker. So I don't know if Mayur wants to directly pose the question that has been already written in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Ronnie, for the presentation. I really like the empirical setting of your study. And my question was so the framing you find was incongruent. And what I'm saying is what were the consequences, in terms of the adoption, the use, or the work practices of different stakeholders in terms of how do they grapple with the technology consequently after you discover that there is a difference in the framing. And my second question was, I think, partly covered in what we just discussed right now, is about the bottom-up effect of framing. Because in my own research, I have seen the framing being, revisited or shaped by the bottom-up effect more than the trickle-down effect. So that was my another. It's just kind of a comment that you also observed similar things in your setting.
Excellent. No, absolutely. Starting from the last one, I would really love to have some references from you on the research you're doing about this, because this is what we're working on right now. Also at the request of the reviewers of the paper, because it is true. I mean, maybe we were caught up a little bit too much of the elegance of these trickle-down conceptualization, but the bottom-up influence factors are probably as important, and we need to go back to the data and then analyze those. So absolutely. Regarding your question about influence on framing on the actual use, it was not part of the research design. I think it is for future research. So what are the consequences of the diversity in frames? We didn't look at actual use, but only at perceived used and framing. So thank you very much, Mayur. And again, the invitation to share with me some reference, it's
Sure.
there live, so you can see my email address here.
Definitely.
Thank you.
We have Aaron.
Yes. Thank you, Ronnie, for the very good presentation. This is Aaron from LSE. So I have just two quick questions. One is about the perception of AI and other technologies in the context of China, because I also have research about AI-based surveillance cameras and how it actually reduces the traffic accident on the road. And I also have interviewed with government staff. And I view it the same as Imani, that that AI and other technologies are viewed as a management fad across all levels. It is a buzzword, and it is push. And I just want to know that in your interview, whether or have you asked them what is different about AI and other technologies when stakeholders talk about it? So this is one perception of technology and AI and other technologies. The other is that the trickle-down structure already discussed by others before. I just want to say that this is a Chinese characteristic. Or context, a Chinese context. How do you generalize to other contexts, like in the European or in the US? And I also want to say that maybe in your method, when you interview these different levels of stakeholders, do their views revealed from the literature actually reflect what actually they believe and behave in adopting AI in hospital? So I just want to talk about the labor replacing role of technology. Even though the managers do not talk about it, they still think it is efficient roles to replace labor and cut the cost of doing complex tasks in the hospital. So I just want to know whether this kind of implicit, they do not disclose what they actually behave, actually will be a challenge for your interview, right? So these are my two questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very good questions. I wish I could answer all of them. Starting from the last one, Absolutely, that's a limitation in the methodology. Social desirability is one limitation. Why IT firm managers don't talk about labor substitutions and doctors do? Well, probably because also they have a conflict of interest because they're in the business of selling this and they should not talk bad about it. So that's one issue. What's very interesting to me is the relevance of the Chinese context. So you asked, for instance, what's the motivation and what was my perception? I would say that the hype among the stakeholders is higher in government compared to stakeholders that are closer with the engagement of the technology. Why? Because what I experience in the Chinese system at this moment, there's a sort of perverse system of incentives, whereas now if you can label a regular analytics technology as AI, you can get a lot of funds. And that's why there's this incentive of calling AI what sometimes ultimately it is not. So that's another source of bias that I think should be investigated empirically. The other thing about generalizability to other contexts, I think it's related also to this. To me, as a political scientist in my primary background, this is very interesting because it relates to this whole literature on models of public policy making. So contrary to some of the more superficial assumptions, the Chinese policy making is a unique blend of top-down and bottom-up. There are some high-level guidelines provided from central government, but then there's a lot of competition and rivalry and experimentation at local level. And that's what we also experimented about AI in public healthcare. Many talk about this concept of fragmented authoritarianism, trying to model this policy-making way. I think whether this is generalizable to other contexts, we need more empirical research to do that. To what extent this trickle down is due to the nature of the IT artifact and to what extent it is a function of the institutional policy-making model. I think we need more data to do that, to be able to conclude about that. But very good point.
Ronnie.
Okay, I think that we can move to next speaker. Ronnie, thank you very much again. I think your presentation offers a lot of potential discussion and implication for all scholars interested in these topics. Beth, let's cue you. Hi, we moved from AI to blockchain. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here this afternoon. I relish every and any opportunity to talk about blockchain technology. And in this talk, I'm going to combine my interest in blockchain with two other favorite things of mine, which are mapping territories, yes, in an intellectual sense, and also using interpretive frameworks to help us understand what we can see in those maps. So I'm going to share some slides with you. I hope you get to see them okay. If you can't see them, please let me know. Okay, so can everybody see my first slide? No, not yet. Sorry.
I can't.
I need to press the button on Zoom. I always forget to do this. Right, share screen. Here we go. There we go. It should come up now. There we go. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to move the dialog box a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Doing this a lot at the moment. I do my teaching online, so. Okay, right. I've been involved in blockchain research since 2016 when I joined Code in Surrey, and I've carried on that interest since moving to Exeter with some of my colleagues from Surrey 2 years ago. And I'm part of a research centre called Index, which is part of the University of Exeter Business School. And I think one or two of my colleagues are part of today's seminar, which is fantastic. Good to see them here. And they will know something about this research because I've been doing it for a while now, but it's one of those projects that has needed some time. As you'll see, it's something that is kind of growing with the field itself. And it started out really with me being interested in the field I had joined. So I kind of joined digital economy as a kind of a new topic area for me, as I say, around about 2016. And I was interested in trying to map the way in which the field was developing. And that interest comes from my background in science and technology studies, where I've published some articles. And in a previous life, I was part of a study where we conducted some research mapping the spread of stem cell research around the world and what was then the regenerative medicine industry. So I like mapping things. I think it can tell us a lot about the world around us and how, in particular, science and innovation are evolving in parallel with, should we say, the economy of science. So one thing we know from looking at other areas of scientific research is that funding often leads to paradigm development. So, and it's very difficult to separate the two. So one of the things I had to do was look for a data set which would enable me to do some initial mapping of how blockchain was being funded and how that funding was then framing the way that the science was developing. So I'm going to talk a lot. I'm going to talk in more detail about the data set I've put together and where it came from and why it's one of very few sources of what we might call comparable data in the area. And I'll explain the reasons for that lack of comparability as I go on. But effectively, I looked at the data that the UKRI publishes on its own funding of blockchain technology. And as an interpretivist, I was interested in both looking at the way that the UK paradigm of blockchain was developing through these funding streams, and also what kind of visions this research was supporting. Yes, because it's I think it's really important to understand what this technology is trying to achieve, particularly as it's often described as a solution looking for a problem, which I think is very apposite in the case of blockchain. Okay, so moving on. So what is blockchain? I've used the term a few times already, yes, in my introduction. Does anyone here not know what blockchain is, or perhaps they're hearing about it for the first time? Okay, so effectively, blockchain technology is a type of information technology, and it's seen very much as a replacement for the types of centralized databases that most institutions and organizations rely on. And the idea of a blockchain is that it provides organizations with a way of creating a history of themselves, of the work that they do, the transactions they undertake, that can be shared in real time along a kind of decentralized frame, yes, around a network. So the idea is that you don't need a central node anymore in order to run your information systems. And this is an idea that has fascinated many people, including myself. And effectively, it's seen as a way of not only sharing data and information more efficiently and effectively, and with a greater degree of transparency, but because you can do one of many things with blockchains, they are multi-layered, and you can do one of many things with them. You can also, as we've seen with the what we can think of as the test bed for blockchain technology, which is the cryptocurrency world, that you can exchange things along the blockchain. So you can use it to facilitate transactions, and you can use it to facilitate, for example, the exchange of goods within supply chains, which is really, I think, one of the most important areas of blockchain development as it stands. So, so lots of advantages. Yes, blockchain has lots of critics, despite having those advantages. A lot of people who say, well, it's an expensive reworking of Excel, and why should we bother? A lot of people who think it's open to misuse. But I think despite some of the many of the criticisms that are leveled at the technology, I think it's going to have an important place in our society going forward, particularly if some of the technical problems that we're experiencing with ensuring that blockchains are as tamper-proof, for example, as we would like them to be, once they are improved upon. And the blockchain world is, I would say, it's a really exciting space for innovation, and where we have lots and lots of potential innovations coming along, and where we are looking at what you might call a third generation of blockchain. We've had two already. I'm just going to move the dialog box again. There we go. So we can really start to think about three eras of blockchain. And as someone interested in paradigms, scientific paradigms, this is really important to me. And I'm sure it will become more important as the technology grows, that we have an understanding that there will be at least three epochs of blockchain. The first is cryptocurrencies, and that's based around what we might think of as the it's a public type blockchain systems where you go on as a pseudonymous user, yes, and it's the cryptocurrency world with all the benefits and potential malfeasances that brings with it. We have a second type of blockchain epoch, which is the one we're in the middle of now, where people are doing an awful lot of problem solving around the technology. And that's towards creating distributed ledgers within organizations that everyone can see and use, and where there's no need for a central authority to govern them. And then there's also a third really exciting area, which is the post-quantum blockchain, because one of the big problems with blockchain 2 is that there is a chance that now we're getting into quantum, and quantum is on its way. There are opportunities, or there are going to be opportunities for people to take over running distributed ledgers. Let's say outside hackers, yes, you've got access to quantum computational abilities, can then take over the systems and run them without the permission of the community that has set the blockchain up in the first place. So we're moving into blockchain 3, and that's all about the post-quantum era. And there are lots of really interesting experiments going on at the moment in creating kind of quantum-proof blockchains. Okay, so before I move on, I think it's really important to kind of highlight some interesting people in the field. And blockchain is a really exciting space, as I've said, but I think one of the most interesting people working in it is Victoria Lemoire, who is writing on it from an information sciences point of view. And I think her work really encapsulates a lot of the debate around the organizational and should we say institutional advantages of blockchain, and the disadvantages as well. But certainly she's done a lot of work around government as well, and around kind of looking at the way in which institutions can make use of blockchain. So I think her work is really interesting, and I just wanted to flag that out in case you hadn't heard about it. So, okay, so moving on. One of the things I wanted to try and understand in looking at the UK position on blockchain technology is whether or not there's a master narrative there, because it certainly started out with one. And there are lots and lots now of different communities, different sovereign states around the world that are developing different takes on the blockchain. And so we can start asking questions about master narratives around the blockchain, which you could say that anyone setting up a blockchain has, but where we might want to shift to looking at whether or not there is a a governmental narrative around blockchain that kind of frames the way in which different nation states are looking at blockchain. And I think that's going to be a really interesting area of social sciences literature going forward. So we could start that process by looking at the UK, and we can ask whether or not we think the UK has a particular master narrative. And one of the things we can say is that it certainly started out that way. So the Walport report from 2016 was written on behalf of the UK government, and it outlines a whole series of directions in which the technology could be taken, both in terms of innovating government, but also government encouraging innovation elsewhere. So I think really we kind of start with a conversation which is about both reframing government, but also then reframing UK PLC in different ways. And there's a tone at the top that's set by Walport, and then the Holmes report, which follows it up. So one of the things we can do is use the information that UKRI put together as part of their gateway for research to look at the ways in which that master narrative might have been implemented, or the ways in which it might have dissipated, or the ways in which it might have changed. And in particular, one thing I was interested in doing, if I just move the dialogue again, sorry, is to think about really what kind of level of investment that's been made, by whom, and where that investment is going. Okay, so these statistics are much harder to track down than they look. Okay, and it took an awful lot of sifting through the GTR to come up with the 73 projects that I've included in my little data set to date, although I noted when I went on there earlier that there are now some more. So, so that 73 will no doubt go up. But effectively, at the time of collating this information, which was really to the end of April, so just before COVID and the hiatus that came in there then in terms of research funding, we had 49 projects funded by Innovate UK. We had 18 funded by EPSRC, 2 by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, 2 by the Strategic Technology and Facilities Council, and 2 by the I've got that the wrong way around. I do apologise. There should be ESRC. Okay, and the combined total of funding comes to £25,064,905. Okay, so that's, again, we need to kind of put this in context. And one of my jobs going forward is to put that in context of overall UK innovation investment from government. But effectively, that's the amount of money that's been invested over 5 years, from what I can see of things. Okay, so 25 million. So what's been done with that money? Interesting question, important question, given that it's funded by the taxpayer. So, okay. So this is a little bit about methodology because, as I say, I'm interested in mapping this territory for a number of reasons, partly to understand where the science is going, partly to understand where the funding is going, and partly to understand where policy is going, really. Yes, you know, kind of what's in the mind of funders and how is that shaping blockchain investments. And the thing to keep in mind is that UKRI often funds projects between university scientists and industry. And a lot of the projects that I've certainly looked at as part of this research have crossed that kind of boundary. Sometimes it's kind of firms, technology firms, yes, without the university support. And I think that's going to become increasingly the case with Innovate UK. That seems to be the pattern going forward. But certainly, I started out wanting to find really a coherent set of information about blockchain, and that's quite difficult to find in the blockchain universe. There's a lot more information out there than there used to be, but certainly finding things where you can actually compare, and where there's, for interpretive research, which I'm going to move on to talking about in a minute, where you need an intertextual parity between use cases is really difficult in blockchain because people write use cases using all sorts of different genre templates and forms. And they're also writing to different sets of objectives. And what I really liked about the GTR and about the way that the public facing side of the GTR is presented is that it has a strong element of genre uniformity. And it also provides you with all of the basic data you need to find out about project, how it was funded, who was involved in it. And increasingly, as a result of the research fish material that then is then added afterwards, when a project closes, you can see what that research money was used for. Yeah, so I think there's another project for me, or for someone further down the line, looking at the outcomes of projects as well as their intentions. And for this project, I'm focused on intentions mostly. So we've got 73 projects that I've managed to identify. And this data set is between April 2015 and April 2020. Although, as I say, I went on this morning and found new projects. So obviously the funding has started up again. This started out very much as an ethics project, and it really, I think it's still firmly got a foot in that camp. And I'm going to show you why in a moment. Because I have, with Glenn Parry and Richard Adams, written about the way in which blockchain is being used to promote ideas of good. And so when I started out doing this, it was partly to try and understand how ideas of public good, ideas of moral conduct, ideas of ethical behavior and ethical futures were being written into and inscripted into blockchain use cases. So, so really, this is a project of two parts. The first part is thinking about mapping and tracking and funding. And the second part is about the interpretive landscape that you can start to assemble, you can start to see once you begin to search the GTR database. And so I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about that next. So my framing for this, my kind of academic framing for this is Sheila Yassinov's work on something called the techno-scientific imagination. And it's a kind of, it's quite an important conversation now within science and technology studies, which is really my kind of home discipline in many respects, and the one I have greatest affiliation with intellectually. And in particular, the idea that as well as having the kind of the way we bring about the way that paradigms develop, it's partly about how they're funded. It's a lot about how, you know, our problem solving, and it's a lot about what scientists find interesting. So it's a lot about discovery, but there's also an awful lot about the imagination in it. And I think this is why it's become such an important and lively conversation, in particular around the fourth industrial revolution, because a lot of use case writing, particularly in the blockchain world, but I think in other areas too, is about looking way ahead to when these technologies are fully viable and where a whole host of problems have been overcome. And so they tend to situate themselves in the future in a space really where we've overcome a lot of the problems of the technology that the technology has in the present. And so I think the gateway to research, it tells us a lot about what's being funded. It tells us where the money's going, but it also tells us a lot about the imaginary. And it tells us about that link between kind of scientists and policymakers and the imaginaries that really work for both those audiences. So, okay, so what were the imaginaries of blockchain in the UK between 2015 and 2020? And how do they link back to a master narrative? These are good questions I think we need to be asking of this particular area. So I think despite the fact that we started out with Wallport and the Holmes report, and there are still really very important policy documents that started a really important conversation and started a, you know, kind of a wave of investment that has produced a lot, now 73 projects. I don't think there's one single master narrative, but a collection of imaginaries. And for definitional purposes, an imaginary is a bit more than saying we want to use the tech, describing what the technology can be used for. It's about all of the repercussions and benefits that might come from it. And often that's shaped by moral and ethical concerns. Yes. And I would say most of the stories, most of the narratives around blockchain have an element of good embedded in them. They want to improve things. So, it's that whole thing of a solution looking for a problem. And in the blockchain world, there are many, many ways in which that has been applied. So a collection of imaginaries around a whole bunch of things. So the first is the supply chain. Yeah, and food security in the UK context is the big one at the moment. And certainly the one that the UK RI have chosen to invest in. Financial markets, and it's kind of doing things like improving the speed of markets, but it's also about improving access for firms and for individuals. So there's an emphasis on access. We've got green energy, and that's about access to markets, incentives for microgeneration in particular, and trying to create a green economy very much at the micro level and within sort of small communities of actors. Okay, next we have environment. And this is about, there's a lot of tagging projects out there, which are fantastic. And they're all about either providing kind of security in the supply chain, but also then cleaning up the environment, getting rid of pollution and waste. Okay, so health is becoming a big area. And I noticed when I went on this morning, there's another project that's been funded around authentication. So this is about the authentication of, in particular, medical qualifications. And it's also then about improving doctor-patient relationships. So there's one particular project which is all about consent and about using the blockchain to both record and then kind of work through a whole series of patient decisions. And that's not just about the recording of the information, that's about creating a new relationship between doctors and patients. And it's often, as I say over here, about empowering. Yes, there's often a kind of a sub-narrative in a lot of these project descriptions I've looked at that are about empowerment in different ways. Okay, cultural preservation is a really important one. And I include in that things like voting systems, yes, and archives, as well as cultural practices and things like, there's a fantastic project the UK government funded on artisan weaving practices in Malaysia, for example. So creative industries, yes, fairer creative IP and payments, yeah, because music industry, often artists don't get the royalties they should receive. Charities, about making the whole process of donating much more transparent. Frictionless trade, if I can say it. Yeah, so this has been an important topic in the last year or so, yeah, for funding. E-voting, very topical given what happened in the US election recently. Transparency is a big theme, covers a number of topics, and also then regulation and trust authentication, which is probably the main reason that the technology has been introduced. Okay, so one of Yassinov's concepts, as well as encouraging us to look at things in terms of the imaginary, so going beyond the what you might call the policy master narrative, she also introduces this idea of civic epistemology, which is the bit that interests me most, because it takes that idea of framing policy agendas one step further. So we all know that when people decide on what to fund, yes, it's the agenda is made up of things that are left out as much as they are left in. And I think this just takes that a step further by looking at what matters to wider society. So we can learn from looking at these different choices of funding and the types of imaginaries they're presenting about what a society thinks is important. And I think in this example, the thing that certainly in the UK, we're prioritizing the most is allocative efficiency and transactional efficiency, which kind of befits the technology, but it also says a lot about us at the moment. Preservation of assets, including those of a cultural nature, encouraging good behaviors through the use of incentives, because blockchain is good for incentivizing people. Yeah, you can use tokens, you can use currencies and so forth to encourage certain types of behavior. And in a small number of cases, and again, I think this is a theme that is kind of on the periphery of UK funding, but it's there, is restorative justice and rebalancing. And that comes out, I think, really in empowering consumers the most. But also there are, the UK government has also funded projects that are about restorative justice in terms of the environment. So this is a UK government, UK policymakers, UKRI really defining their terms. Yes. And what I've noticed, sorry, I'm going to have to move dialogue again. There we go. Is that really in this situation, the civic epistemology is narrowing at the moment. It's narrowing to a few areas. So food security, frictionless trade, and I think health are the three areas that the UK government is likely to take forward, which is kind of a narrowing of horizons. And we can ask lots of questions about that, all of which are very interesting. So I'm going to stop talking now. And yeah, take some questions. I hope that was interesting.
Thank you, Beth. It was definitely fascinating for me, and I look forward to some questions. We have one in the chat. So, Carsten, you made the point.
Yeah. Sorry.
Hi.
Yes. Hello. Thanks, Beth. Very interesting. And I personally, I do think that this idea of exchanging tokens on Bitcoin, I think is probably not the most interesting way of using blockchain. So I think I really like your perspective. I think it's extremely interesting. So my question was just, in all of these projects, whether you've sort of seen intent to sort of attack this technology from a slightly more critical stance than just assuming it. Because I think all these assumptions that all the little Bitcoin boys and girls, they forward on code is law and law is code is bullshit.
Yes.
So what have you got to say about these projects in terms of a more critical stance towards the simplistic narratives of the technology?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because certainly in the data set I've looked at, the projects that I mentioned towards the end, which are on the periphery of UK government funding, and really this is kind of all being channeled by what our current kind of political climate will deem acceptable. But still, you find people who are doing things that are socially quite radical in many respects. So some of the green projects that the UK government, and again, I'm just going by what's publicly available in terms of the public information on them, are actually bringing about quite radical social change. But it's kind of, as long as it speaks the language of business, I think people are, you can find the right way of framing it, then you might stand a chance of being funded. But effectively, there are people out there who are being funded by the UK government, but where they are more reflective of shall we say, the more communitarian sovereign communities of blockchain out there who are doing things that are really quite radical socially. Yes. And there's a paper I wanted to mention, actually. We went past it, but here, I'm just going to share again. Where are we at the bottom? This is a fantastic paper on the kind of the politics of blockchain in a radical context, and about communities who are trying to live differently through blockchain. So that's a fascinating paper. Okay, yeah. So there's a lot out there, and there's a lot of people who look at blockchain and think it's it's just a glorified spreadsheet, and other people who look at it and think it could do wonders for changing the world.
There's nothing wrong with spreadsheets. The point is, I think there's an interesting paradox there, because I've seen other cases and local production of electricity and all. There are lots and lots of examples of these, and Mary Lassity has found some of these, and the point is that it's almost the paradoxical relationship between counting and community. That you can almost say that you don't need all the counting of contributions if you have community, but the communities that start counting, and maybe they become stronger communities or different communities. So I think all I can say is to watch. I mean, obviously interesting for you to watch this space, but we should all watch this space, because I think something could happen that is unexpected.
I think so. And I think, you know, while we've got the shaping of the science of blockchain along particular paths in the UK, I think that, you know, there's some comparative analysis to be done with how it's being shaped elsewhere by governments, but also then by other interested actors. Non-corporate actors are doing an awful lot of shaping in the blockchain world. So it is, I think we're going to end up with this comparative analysis of different interpretations of what blockchain should be doing socially as much as anything. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Other questions or comments? One thing that I wanted to ask to you, Beth, is about this narrative can fit also with the concept of public value, which I mean is something that I haven't seen the exact word, the public value concept, but I think that many of the imaginaries that you enlisted might concur to a co-production or co-creation of public value, especially if we were to let's say conceptualize blockchain in a different way. So instead of the efficiency effectiveness approach or perspective, we can definitely I think public value can be also a lens through which looking at blockchain and both from let's say policymaker perspective or decision maker perspective, but also for communities, local communities or bottom-up actors. And this is one just thing that came to my mind when I saw your presentation.
Thank you for that. Yes, and in fact, the texts I've been using are kind of these short 500-word abstracts that are put out for public consumption, and I'm kind of fascinated by the eloquence of them, really, and how much when we write these project descriptions as part of our funding applications, we build into them, and in particular that they are a lot of the texts I've been looking at, short though they are, because most of them are under 500 words, they are all about public value, and they're all about kind of value to the taxpayer, as well as kind of highlighting the scientific and kind of economic achievements that the project could bring about. So that there's a lot of, I mean, public value is really important, to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
I maybe have a question. Maybe it's a stupid question. Maybe you mentioned this, but I was curious because Francesco started talking about co-creation, and co-creation obviously includes many different stakeholders, right? So I was wondering, do you have a lot of information about these different stakeholders and what kind of role they have in these projects as well? So who is actually involved?
Well, that's what I want to do next. Yes, because I've been focused on putting the data set together, which did take a lot of time, and obviously it's something that I've had to watch and wait for. Because when I first looked at it in 2017, I think there were 20 projects or something, 25 projects, maybe 27, and it has grown. And I've got a nice kind of distribution curve that Roger's wife Wendy did for me. Yes, showing how that distribution works. But effectively, there is room, I think, there are 3 sort of different streams of research using this database. And kind of one of them is about the networking involved and who the various partners are. And I became interested in doing this because I was in a research centre where we were part of the network who were receiving monies to do blockchain research. So yes, there's definitely a paper in that.
Yeah, interesting, because we just talked about AI, right? And there's this whole movement now how citizens in some ways should also actually be involved in these kinds of AI projects. So I was just wondering if something that was going on there in the case of blockchain. But yeah.
That's a really good question. I think in the UK context, it's mostly quite traditional sort of relationships between industry partners and academic partners. But having said that, there are some really interesting projects when you go online and look for them where there is an element of co-creation, particularly ones around the charitable sector.
Interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. And I was looking for other questions, but otherwise, or contribution. Otherwise, we can move to the next speaker, and thank Beth for the very, very interesting presentation about blockchain and these imaginaries.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, really enjoyed it. I hope that was useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I do think so. Okay. So I take the lead and help to share my screen. Okay, you should see it now. Okay, so basically, this is, I just want to give a brief overview of this paper, and hope to get as many comments and feedbacks as you can. Low technology and policies, a complex negotiation to generate value. This research comes from one of the projects institute my PhD dissertation, and therefore I'd like to introduce a little bit of my experience that brought me to work on these issues, and that allowed me now to present. And I also want to thank Will and the organizer for the opportunity to present in front of such a distinguished audience. Okay, so as Ronnie, I also have a background in political science, and in a former life before getting to academia, I had the opportunity to work as an advisor in the Italian government, dealing with digital technologies, both at national and at European level, which allowed me to see from the very inside how lawmakers deal with technologies, and how the knowledge and the awareness of technology by lawmakers influenced the way that they did design government policies, and policies that were based on this kind of, were based on technology. And so when I moved to academia, I began working on these issues, and in particular to try to investigate how lawmakers, if and where the lawmakers had the opportunity to know how ICT might impact and inform on the outcome of the lawmaking process. This was my motivation. The purpose of this paper is to show and try to find how technology can play a role when it is deployed in designing government policies and act of laws, regulations, legislation, and so on, trying to understand if, from the lawmaker's point of view, there is an awareness of the characteristic of technology that might modify the outcome of a policy, and to play and to impact on the outcomes of the public. Just to give you a brief understanding of where I do position this research that I co-authored with Antonio Cortella, we build on the assumption that technology is not a neutral tool. It has regulative, it might play as a regulative regime, which means that it transforms the context where it is adopted, and it has a huge impact on the outcomes, on the policy outcomes where technology is adopted and deployed. Hence, we try to make a contribution by highlighting that technology design is indeed the key element of the lawmaking process, because as I tried to demonstrate, it impacts on the very public service provision and on the overall value creation which engenders from the public service provision in public organizations. I will rely on a theoretical framework. I'll try to explain it in a couple of slides. And this brought me to the case that we try to understand and we try to describe. I had the opportunity to look at the Italian reform of the public sector, and in particular of the judiciary system through technology. And Italian legislators wanted to modify and shape and reform many branches of the judiciary system, in particular the one which deals with foreclosed property market. The problem was that a lot of real estate executed properties could not be sold in the market. Hence, the institutes of credits and the creditors were accumulating a lot of non-performing loans due to the fact that they were not able to sell the properties the executed properties in the market, which meant that there was a difficult economic recovery for the country, because banks and institutes of credit were not able to perform and to put up money in the cycle of the economy. Legislators wanted to fix this problem within the major context of the civil trial reform. One of the objectives was to increase the openness, liquidity, and efficiency of the markets for NPLs. How? Among a number of different measures and policies, there was also the use of ICT as one of the key elements in order to overcome this problem. So the idea was that the more users could access information about foreclosed properties, the more the auctions and the selling of these properties could be enhanced, with potential positive effects for the economy as a whole. The specific choice that I will be focusing on is the creation of dedicated portal, a public portal, which is the Portale delle vendite pubbliche in Italian, public sales portal, a completely public portal owned and run by the Ministry of Justice, which was supposed to attract new users and allow users to better acquire information about the properties, allow people to get information, to participate to the auctions, to visit the properties, and to make offers, which all these mechanisms were supposed to increase the participation to the market, which was not very efficient. One thing I should mention is that the choice to launch from the scratch a new public portal run by the Ministry of Justice happened in the context where there were also, and there are also, many other private portals which belong to private companies well established in the market with 20 or more years of experience in the sector, which basically do the same thing. Private portals hold advertisement of properties, and the public portal, PVP, was supposed to do exactly the same thing. We wanted to understand, we tried to understand whether this public new portal launched by the Minister of Justice, which was at the very core of the public policy at the heart of the legislation, was able to increase the number of people actually interested or potentially interested in the auctions, if it was able to attract new users and provide the services that were expected by this portal. In order to do so, we rely on some key concepts of the network economics theory. So we are looking at concepts that I'm sure many of you already know very well, which are the ability to acquire critical mass, the capacity to switch users from other portals or from other platforms, and the analysis of this research is based on a comparison between different portals, the private ones, a selection of the private ones which match a list of criteria, let's say the most important ones in terms of also engagement, and the public one, to see if the launch and the establishment of this new public portal was successful and created an impact in this electronic market. Some of the findings, some of the results from the comparison. Here you can see the trend of traffic, and the public portal is the green line at the bottom. Launched in April 18. Here there is a lag of 6 months where we analyze the data, and we see that two elements from this picture. First one, that the public, in terms of traffic on the website, PVP was not able to reach the highest levels of traffic that many other private did. The blue line, stakeholder.it, is the leading portal in the sector with a long tradition of working in this market, and we see that the difference is really impactful, because it's 10 times difference. But on the one hand, and on the other hand, the presence of the new instrument had no effect on the traffic of others, meaning that, as you can see, the trajectory and the slopes of traffic were not impacted by the launch of the new one. Another element of comparison that we used is the traffic through referrals, meaning from where the traffic and the users come from when they land to PVP, and where do they go when they leave the portal. And as you can see, the trade-off between PVP and the two leading portals, Arte Giudiziaria and Asta Legale, the first two, is negative, which means that the number of web users that go to that leave the portal and go to the private one is bigger than the number of people that do the other way around, which means that private portals benefit from the presence of the public one, instead of the public one benefiting from people coming from other private websites. Where the trade-off is positive is with these two small websites, which are not officially recognized from the Ministry of Justice, which is another criteria that we observed, and in that the impact and the capacity to switch web users from established private portals to the public one has not been really achieved by this new page. Another element is the traffic by country. To reinforce this argument, you can see in the first line, although we can see that most of the websites and the portals that work in the market are able to attract people mainly from Italy, PVP did hit quite low standards in this respect, and a lesson that we can derive from this comparison is that whereas the private portals were able to attract people mostly from Italy, the public one was not able to go beyond and perhaps exploit some opportunities that came from abroad, since it was perfectly possible to access to the auctions, to Italian auctions, also for non-Italian citizens. In that case, things that we can learn is that PVP just followed the line of all the others private portals with very low numbers in comparison with that. So it didn't create any added value, for instance, to for instance, to abroad citizens that might be interesting and might increase the number of people accessing the market. Perhaps the most striking comparison that we experienced it when we look at this at the different contents and functionalities. So here you can see the leading one, private one on the left, and the PVP on the right. I would like to make you aware that these two pages refer to the same single property. But as you can see in the private one, here you can access a number of information and functionalities. Look at the map, for instance, or at the possibility to exploit some online services, which are simply not included in the PVP in the page with the same adverts for the property, which is held on the public service, on the public portal. Once again, and I could mention a lot of any additional functionalities that the public portal cannot offer to users, such as it has not an app for mobile devices, it has not any landing pages on the social media, and many, it has not strike any partnership, for instance, with Google Maps or with other information providers. So all of these, and this was a graphic comparison, to come to some main findings that I'd like to share with you, and that can serve as a potential point of departure for a discussion. So the data that we collect show that the choice of the lawmakers or the legislators were to enable a portal which in the end did not attract any potential users, or very limited share of potential users. Hence, the technological choice failed to provide the service and content needed to build the critical mass and to trigger the network effect, which can provide value and can enrich and definitely increase the attention on the market, which tells us a very important story, that the design choice made by the lawmakers have an important impact on the outcome of legislation, which was unfortunately not the expected one. And many critics, and especially in the professional arena, many professionals, many critics or observers about the civil trial and the judiciary in the judiciary field made this kind of observation based on reality, and we try to articulate and to expand this and to build on this assumption in order to provide a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of why lawmakers' choice was not able to fulfill the expected, deliver the intended outcomes. Hence, and to conclude the paper, to conclude my presentation, there are some lessons for the lawmakers. In particular, perhaps the most important point is that Italian lawmakers could have made the strategic choice to design from the scratch a completely new instrument, a new portal, which was simply launched in a field where many others were present and many others were already doing well in the same market, and instead try to rely on the private ones and strike partnership and arrange deals. Zoopla, the UK government has done something very similar with Zoopla in the UK, for instance, in trying to exploit the network effects. And the findings of this research can be quite consistent with other researches that show that in order to evaluate the significance of a policies of this kind, we can lawmakers could focus on creating a network, a web ecology, and creating a network effect with already existing search engines or information providers, instead of establishing a new completely owned portal. So instead of adding an additional layer, which can risk to be lost among the number of existing actors that already shape the market or already build the market, lawmakers should be very aware of the technological characteristic and the possibility that technology might impact on the policy outcome, and be consistent with that, and accordingly try to fit and to find the correct place for any government portal which can better fit with an efficient network of already existing sources where they can establish a dialogue and create much more value than a traditional top-down policy. And that's it. So I don't know if we have time for the plenary discussion, but I very welcome your comments. As I was saying, this was part of my PhD dissertation, already presented in conferences. We are now trying to finalize it and to find and to send and to submit it to a journal publication.
Are there any specific questions for Francesco? Thank you. Because you were the chair, you cannot thank yourself, but thank you very much for the presentation, Francesco. I think it was really interesting. Any questions? I think also, indeed, maybe we can start with, oh, so Ronnie has raised his hand, so that's good. Ronnie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very interesting. I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate more on what is your next step in the research plan now that you have mapped these differences between the portals?
Well, the idea is to elaborate on those differences. Thank you very much for your point. And the idea was to show how the choice made by lawmakers. I haven't touched the point, all the process and all the debate that was up among lawmakers in parliaments and in assembly, and also together with civil officials in ministries. So not only lawmakers in parliament, but also civil policymakers in the administration. But the idea was and is to better conceptualize how lawmakers should be aware of the limits and of the potentiality of technology when they have to draft and design legislation based on legislations that involve technology adoption. Because one of the findings is that given that the choice was not effective, what happened when the decision of implementing a new portal was taken, and whether there wasn't a sufficient awareness of the technological characteristics when the decision was taken. Because and I go back to the motivation for my study. One of the risk that happened whenever lawmakers take part, they directly part to a new legislation that involves technology, and we see that it happens more and more it's more frequent than ever, is that do they have the necessary awareness of what implying technology mean, or will they simply leave it to officials, leave it to public servants that are in charge, so designers and engineers are in charge to design a policy based on a technology. And in this gap, I think there's a potential interest for research, and so this would be one direction that I would like to talk, but I would like to take.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that would be an interesting direction. In the meantime, also Hono asked a question in the chat. Maybe Hono, you want to elaborate on that yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a good question from Hono, and I thank you for the question. Yeah, that was there were no apparent reasons according which lawmakers did not want to rely on existing ones, but simply I think that since the Ministry of Justice was called to run and manage the public portal, so the decision was, since we have to since this policy is a part of comprehensive judiciary system reform, we want to create our own instrument. We want to launch it, and probably I think one true potentiality of the public portal was to contain all the adverts for the properties in the national landscape. I think that it was a policy choice. We want our ministry to run a portal, a public one. The point is that the connections between this choice and the reality, the existing reality, was not correct, or at least was insufficient from the people that assumed this decision.
Any more questions? I may have a question, and it's not just about your research, but also about Ronnie's and also in a way Beth's, because we've been talking a lot about awareness, right? And how those people who make the decisions essentially need to be aware of the technology and of the characteristics of the technology. You know, traditionally we've been talking about people need to have technological affinity or affinity with the different technologies. And I've also in my own research continuously been claiming like managers need to have knowledge about all these different technologies in order to be able to make decisions. But then people ask me, and I'm going to ask you the same question. So is everyone now expected to have knowledge about everything? Like, should we actually educate all of these people in all the different technologies, or to what extent, how would you see that? Maybe you can answer that, and Ronnie as well.
I can give you my perspective also that I'm trying to elaborate right now, and it's another part of my PhD dissertation that I plan to work on. We cannot expect policymakers and lawmakers to know everything, and we cannot expect all the policymakers to be information system engineers if when they have to deploy technological instruments in the policy. But in my view, it's possible that, and it's desirable that people in charge of drafting and designing legislation or policies can find the instruments and can find mechanism to increase the awareness. And when I say awareness, I don't say only the single individual awareness, but a kind of collective awareness, which can include, for instance, the people in the parliament, the advisor and the engineers who have to practically and physically design the instrument. So I think that this can be soft law mechanism, so interactions, pilot projects, or other ways to create a dialogue between those actors involved in the policy making process. But I think it's possible. We cannot expect the single individual to study this kind of issues, but there are the instruments to increase the general awareness.
And also Edgar has a very useful comment about this, I think, a paper about the distinction between interactional and contributory expertise. Yeah, that I think that could be very useful. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other questions generally or about Francesco's presentation? Just general points. Okay, well, I guess we are nearing the end. So thanks again, Francesco, for your presentation. Thank Ronnie, thanks Beth. Also, I think, yeah, generally all the presentations were very interesting. I think you guys have triggered some discussion and some, yeah, we have a lot of things that we need to think about. But your research is, of course, a good step in trying to impact these kinds of issues. Okay, so maybe just a concluding comment. As I mentioned at the start, we are having these seminars every couple of months. So we are trying to develop now a schedule with topics that are yet to come, and keep an eye on the website. Also, we will, of course, email you when we have new sessions planned. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed it. I certainly did. I hope the speakers enjoyed it. And it was for you too. Are you guys okay with maybe sharing slides or yeah? Oh, okay, so let me know. Maybe you can send the slides to me and we can distribute it. Of course, as mentioned, we will also distribute this the video of these seminars. And yeah, I guess everyone just needs to enjoy their evening then, and hopefully see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.